very pleased indeed to introduce Farah Ahmed, who lives in Slough but is doing a doctorate in Cambridge, and she has been involved in Islamic education for 20 years, and you know, it's a very interesting development. I'm just having to refer to my notes here to get the titles correct, but she's just recently been involved in setting up something called the Centre for Research and Evaluation of Muslim Education, the Institute of Education in London University. And she's also involved in Islamic teacher education courses, which is a very interesting thing she might mention today. And is Director of Education at the Islamic Shakhsiyah Foundation. So, I mean, a number of different kinds of very interesting involvement with Islamic education, and her PhD is what she's going to be telling us about today, which is, as you can see, about exploring halakha as a research method. I should say that Farah has to leave really very promptly to get a train, so she'll be out the door definitely at just after 8 o'clock. So I'm gonna keep time fairly strictly because of that. There will be time for questions, I'm sure, so that's no problem. But if the questions are coming thick and fast and people don't have a chance to squeeze their question in, please email Farah. She's very happy to take email questions. Her address is in the booklet here, some copies at the front. So please don't feel that you're shortchanged on opportunities to discuss with her. But there will be time for questions. Don't worry. Just thought I'd better give you a warning that we are going to be finishing very promptly. Great. So that's it. Really, over to you, Farah.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, good evening everybody. Thank you very much to Sophie and everybody else at the Centre here for inviting me to speak about the research method I actually used in my Masters. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is, I've put the title, A Tentative Approach to Developing some Islamic Research Principles and within a critical and indigenous context. So it's really something which is a work in progress, and just I'd be very interested in hearing your feedback on what you think about what I'm saying today. Okay, so what is halakha? There's an image there of a traditional halakha, capturing, often based in the home, in the mosque, in schools, the kutubs, the schools for young children that they've been there for many centuries. It's something that you'll see wherever you find Muslims. Halakha is something that we've adapted in the primary school I work in, and that's where the interest in halakha came about. So there's a slide there which is just explaining a little bit about the history of halakha, the fact that it's credited in some ways, that the loose, informal educational approaches that were there in Muslim societies and Muslim communities is credited to some degree of the transformative nature of Islamic education, the intellectual heritage of Islam, and of all the kinds of learning communities that have been developed in Muslim societies, past and present. Format of halakha can vary immensely. It can be transmission-based, teacher-led, and more that's what we're seeing at the moment. That's the contemporary sort of example. But it also can be a collaborative group effort. And the curriculum is open, it's really informal, loose, anybody can start a halakha, people do it in all sorts of different kind of ways. I think what interested me particularly is the form of teaching that the Prophet used in teaching his companions. And the fact that is the approach that he took was something that we thought was quite important, so we began to use halakha in our schools, and I'll show you a little example of that in a little while, with quite young children. The example that I'm going to show you, I want to contextualize it a little bit because it relates to our topic. I work in a very small Islamic primary school. We started out as homeschoolers. We have a very alternative ethos. We approach education in a totally different kind of way. I'd love to talk to you more about that, but I can't because of time constraints. But one of the things that we do, we've been doing for about 5-6 years now, is every year with our 7 to 11-year-olds, we do something called an Islamic Inventions Fair. And what they have is that each year group has a topic, and they have to go out and research a Muslim scientist or a Muslim discovery, which is actually quite challenging because unlike books about Marie Curie and Michael Faraday, it's very hard to find children's books about people like Ibn Sina or Al-Farabi or any of the great Muslim scientists and scholars that there were. So the children have to go out and do some research, and they have to come back with a 3D model, and they have to produce a 2D display which will include some written work, some artwork, and the key thing that they have to do is actually do an oral presentation. Then we hold an exhibition which is open to the wider public. So this is something that we've been doing for a long time. We've had a lot of recognition from people like 1001 Inventions and so on. So the halakha, I'm going to show you, before I come to the halakha, just show you a picture of the exhibition so you can see that they're looking at medical development in Islamic heritage. They get to dress up as well, which they love doing, and it's a lot of fun. So that's a practical example of what you can see of the work that they do. So in the context of the halakha, I'm going to show you, this is a year 3 class, and their topic at that time was astronomy and the universe. So they were looking at scientific discoveries to do with astronomy and the universe, which obviously there's a lot of Islamic heritage for that. And what happened is that I was doing a few halakha with them, and what we did a various range of things. We spent some time looking at, on the interactive whiteboard, a screen of just the night sky, and they contemplated a black screen with stars, and just asked them how that made them feel, what that made them think about. Then we looked at a daffodil. And so we had a daffodil in the centre of the halakha, and we were talking about the daffodil and what that made them think. We were talking about the concept of the signs of Allah and how Allah created these things and how we're here to discover them and what things you can discover, how you can dissect the daffodil, all sorts of things. So there's a context to the little clip I'm going to show you. They've been doing all this work on scientific discoveries. And I'm hoping to get this right because I couldn't manage to edit it to the little bit I wanted to show you, but I will play it and then hopefully stop it at the right time. Okay, I think I need to go back a little bit. So you can see that I'm going to talk to them about science and Islam. This topic begins to come up, and what I'd like you to see is how the children respond to some of the questions that I put to them.
You know, some people say that if you believe in a God, then you wouldn't use science.
What? That
You know that?
doesn't make sense.
That doesn't make sense. Why doesn't that make sense? Because you're Muslims and you're doing science.
And also like the Christians, they believe in a God, and they say the scientists.
But some people say that if you really want to be a scientist, then you can't, leave God out of it.
Why?
Because if you want to get the real, honest truth about what's really happening, then you don't need to talk about a God.
But Allah is the one that helps you do this.
But they're saying that if you believe in Allah, you wouldn't study the science properly because you're just saying, oh, Allah did it, oh, Allah did it, oh, Allah did it. Is that what the Muslim scientists did?
No.
What did they do? Do you think they were thinking about Allah when they did these things?
Yeah.
What makes you think that? Khadija, why do you think that? They wouldn't be able to think about all these things. So somebody who doesn't believe in Allah can't be a scientist. Safa, what do you think?
If people believe in God, they still would think, they still would be able to be a scientist, but they would still think of Allah as well, because they're Muslims.
They were Muslims. Did believing in Allah help them to be scientists?
Yeah.
Why? What do you mean?
Because when they look at Allah, they think of Allah and then they get lots of ideas.
They wanted to understand Allah Subhanahu creation. They wanted to understand the creation of Allah. They wanted to work out, how did Allah do this? How does it work? What's happening that is making this work? Yes, you know.
No one of these inventions that they made, but they made it to help people.
To help people, but people who don't believe in Allah do inventions to help people.
They help people with this.
not just about helping people is very important. What I'm trying to get you to think about is, you know, when you have some visitors, I'm sure we have some non-Muslim visitors to your exhibition. A lot of people think in this society that believing in God does not go with doing science. They think science is about just, you don't think about God when you do science. That's wrong. Completely. They think that if you just think about God all the time, you wouldn't do science. And one of the things that you're going to, inshallah, that just doing the exhibition for the inventions that you're talking about, just by doing it, you're showing that in fact, it's the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's the Quran which asks you this, verse in Surah Al-Baqarah and other verses, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, have you not thought about this? Look at the signs in this. Look at the signs in that. And Allah is asking you to think. Okay, let me read some more out.
Okay, I'll stop it there. So you can see it's an interactive discussion, and the children are very intrigued by what I'm saying to them, and they're thinking quite deeply about it, asking quite a few questions about it as well. So this is an example of halakha, and because it was on the topic of research and science and what it means to learn something and what it means to gain knowledge, I thought it would be a good example to show you of halakha in action. Okay, so the context of where we're coming from is that Muslims, since the early 1900s, have been trying to work out how to deal with the modern world and how to deal with the situation whereby, certainly in higher education, but also even at a primary level, the modes of education that exist in the Muslim world are Western-based models. And the European experience of separating out science, knowledge, research, education from religion, which happened over the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, has been imported into the Muslim world, and Muslims are trying to engage with this and struggle with this. So just like these children who have this belief because they've been taught about their religion, they're quite shocked to find that people have this view. Muslim researchers, Muslims who are working in higher education, Muslim scientists even, we struggle with this idea of having a secular-based research model and consider where we fit in with that. And that's the context of what I'd like to talk about. Now, there's a few movements since the 19th century. There's probably many, but I want to give just very briefly 3 examples of movements that I've looked at which have tried to address this. So you have the Islamization of knowledge movement, which was based around Ismail al-Faruqi and Naqib al-Atas, happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. And that was talking about taking modern knowledge and Islamizing it. Some of you will be quite familiar with this. It has its critics, it has its people who are feel that it has failed in many ways, and one of the things that is brought out about this is that methodologically there is very little work done on how to approach research, how to approach knowledge from an Islamic basis. That what tends to happen is there's a lot of critique of what's happening in the West, particularly in the 70s and 80s when you had the whole interpretivist and social constructionist models coming out, and there was a lot of critique about the positivist and post-positivist models that existed. Muslims are jumping onto this bandwagon, making that critique, but the point that other people are making is, yeah, but they're not coming up with anything as a response to it. They're not coming up with an alternative. You're talking about Islamized knowledge. What does that mean? How can knowledge be Islamized? How can science be Islamized? So lots of questions around that. You then obviously have the traditionalism movement, which is very popular amongst Muslims, say Nasser, Guy Eaton, people of that kind of thing, who see knowledge as something sacred, who see a spiritual dimension to it, and feel that losing that spiritual dimension has taken the essence, the human aspect actually out of knowledge. It's in fact that, unlike the humanists or secular people, they believe that without that spiritual sacred dimension, which could be religious, could even be non-religious, knowledge loses its value. So they were talking about things like the impact on the environment, the impact on the world since the 1960s up until this date. Again, it's it's talking about having a spiritual dimension to knowledge, but there's nothing really that you can work with, or how do you approach that. It's a very personal thing. You have what is known as the Ijmali or the transmodernism movement, which is based very squarely in the UK with Ziauddin Sardar and the Welsh Muslim Meryl Wynne Davis, and people around that who've been talking about addressing modernism from a different perspective. So I was looking at these kind of things, that the idea that for the transmodernism is that you have a plurality of modernities based from different worldviews, and Islam would be one of the worldviews that contributes to that. All of these movements, that the criticism of where's the methodology, where's the substance, how do you approach it, okay, these are grand ideas, these are things that you want to do, those criticisms are there, and it is difficult to find examples of where those ideas have been translated into something physical, something practical. And I couldn't find very many examples of this either. When I was doing my master's and doing what postgraduate students do, is trying to work out, how am I going to approach this study? I was studying the concept of holistic Islamic education in the schools that I work in. What am I going to do? This was something that I was wrestling with, and this is how I came along with the idea of using the halakha as a research method. And where I actually ended up taking inspiration from is, interestingly enough, is something called Kaupapa Maori, which is Maori research loosely translated, or Maori forms of knowing, which is based in New Zealand. And there's a scholar, Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who very famously wrote a book called Decolonizing Methodologies. And I will actually just read this out to you, because I think it encapsulates a worldview which then relates to research. So Kaupapa Maori is the conceptualization of Maori knowledge that has been developed through oral tradition. It is the process by which Maori mind receives, internalizes, differentiates and formulates ideas and knowledge exclusively through Te Reo Maori. Kaupapa Maori is esoteric and Tuturu Maori. It is knowledge that validates a Maori worldview and is not only Maori owned but also Maori controlled. One of the criticisms that Tuhiwai Smith makes is, and it's a lovely phrase she uses, which she says that research is one of the dirtiest words in the vocabulary of indigenous peoples. That indigenous peoples who have been researched for so long in so many different all kinds of ways that people have run out of things to research about indigenous peoples, for those peoples, the term research, she says, is a dirty word, because it equates to exploitation, it equates to colonialism. So she's a Maori scholar trying to address that. So she wants to engage in research, but she wants to do it from her own worldview, her own basis. It's a critical approach, an indigenous approach that is there to empower Maori people. So this is done successfully through Te Reo Maori. I don't know the essences of all these terms, I just find it quite inspirational. I think it's important that she does use these terms, which are from a different language, because clearly for her, the meaning of these terms cannot be easily translated. And that meaning is encapsulating certain concepts which are alien to the Western way of structuring knowledge, whatever kind of Western paradigm is used. The only language that can access, conceptualize and internalize in spiritual terms this body of knowledge, this Kaupapa Maori knowledge, is exclusive to. For no other knowledge in the world has its origins in Rangitea. As such, it is the natural and only source for the development of a mechanism which aims to transmit exclusively Kaupapa Maori knowledge. Okay, so how do you do this? How does this go about? And this is something that what the Maori researchers have done is they've come up with certain principles which guide their research. And these are very broad principles, but those principles are there to lay a foundation, to put some parameters, to have something to draw upon. So they talk about the principle of self-determination. So the Maori people should determine for themselves what is happening to them. Principle of cultural aspiration. They should be able to aspire to their own cultural heritage. Principle of a culturally preferred pedagogy. So this is culturally relevant education, something similar to what we're doing with our children with the Islamic Inventions Fair, where they're learning about science through an Islamic lens and not seeing science as something that exclusively happened in Europe and doesn't really happen anywhere else. The principle of socio-economic mediation, of extended family structure, of collective philosophy, the Treaty of Waitangi, which is actually the treaty between the Maori tribes and the British Empire, which they feel gave them some space, some way of controlling their own destiny, and they don't want that to be undermined. And the principle of growing respectful relationships. So I'm not going to dwell too long on this because I've got a lot to cover in very little time. So the way I then approached it is that I then thought, okay, if this is the case, then we need some Islamic research principles. A few people have actually done something like this before. Ismail Faruqi put together some principles, but they weren't so much methodological as epistemological or ethical. I didn't find that they were useful to me for setting up, writing up my methods section of my dissertation. There is another scholar in Canada called Jasmine Zine, and she's talked about some principles of critical faith-based epistemology, but again, I didn't think that it was necessarily as useful for me. So I put these principles together. Okay, so I expect a lot of criticism because, what do I know about setting it down a basis for Islamic research? So the first principle would be the primacy of Quran and the prophetic sayings. And I think for me personally as a Muslim researcher, if I'm talking about knowledge that means something to me, I can't take that away. Obviously a non-Muslim would think, what on earth is that to do with anything? But for me, the Quran is the literal word of God, and the prophetic sayings are there to explain the Quran. It's a revealed text and ultimate guiding force for Muslims. The second research principle is the combining classical Islamic scholarship and sciences with a range of other research methods. Unlike Sardar and Merwin Davis, who critique the methodologies that are there in the traditional Islamic sciences, I can understand their frustrations with it, and I can see that those methodologies are doing very little to help the Muslim community today. Nevertheless, my point is that there is a tradition, and that tradition was something that generated and flourished and produced very relevant knowledge for centuries. The tradition, to some degree, was interrupted by colonialism. And I don't personally think that you can just start from scratch. I think you have to try and pick up where it left off. So I think there has to be something which you're drawing upon traditional methodologies, things like ijtihad, things like usul al-fiqh, those kind of things, which scholars were using to understand law essentially, but within the wider social sciences, adapt that in some kind of ways. And this needs a lot of work, this needs a lot of creativity, a lot of dynamism, but I don't want to throw it out the window and say, let's just start from scratch, and let's just go straight to the Quran and Sunnah. So I think the classical scholarship has got to have a place to play within this. The third principle is of using all faculties of human understanding. This is what many indigenous researchers and qualitative researchers as well, a lot of Western qualitative researchers talk about, is that it's going beyond the purely rational, the purely aqli based, to use this Quranic terminology. But going beyond that, and if you're looking at the Quranic concept of aql, intellect or reason, it has a spiritual dimension as well as a rational dimension. So that it should, faculties of understanding, human faculties of understanding are not just reason-based. They're intellectual, they're rational, they're also intuitive and spiritual. There are some feminist communitarians who would agree with this kind of thing as well. So it's just taking away that pure scientific, reason-based approach to knowledge and learning and research. Principle of centering the human situation in research. So research needs to be centered around the needs of the human beings, not the needs of the funders or of a government with a particular agenda or so on. Something that we all can relate to, we all can see, but that it needs to serve the community that is being researched. Again, that's a principle that the Maori are upholding, and I think that it probably is really good research anywhere would do this, but certainly for Muslim community researching Muslims, that it needs to be centering the human situation of the Muslims that you're researching. Islamic ethics and etiquette. We have research ethics. As Muslims, we have our own code of ethics which we live by. We have a certain adab or etiquette. I mean, etiquette is not a word that explains what adab is. So bringing those concepts of akhlaq and adab into our research ethics, and research ethics going beyond just ticking off forms. which again, all good research has excellent research ethics, so it's not that it's not there, but it's that it has an Islamic cultural lens or religious lens to it. The principle of collaborative, participative, transformative and useful research. So research which isn't just there for the researcher. Because in Islam, seeking knowledge, we have that concept, isn't it, of iman and action, that there's no iman without amal. The belief, the values have to be embodied in what you do. And what you do has to be transformative. What you do with your life has to have an impact. You don't do things because it's a job. This is not the ethics of a Muslim. This is not the value system of a Muslim. So research should not be something that you're doing just to get that piece of paper which says that you're now a doctor, you're a doctor of philosophy or whatever it is. But that's not the purpose behind it. It has to be meaningful. It has to have an impact. It's got to make a change in the community that you're serving. Okay, so those are the principles, and this is explaining a diagram to explain how the Islamic research method kind of came about. So you have on the outer circle, you have an interpretivist paradigm, and I felt that was the only way that I could locate it within something, because it's certainly not positivist. It's interpretivist within an Islamic sense, and there's a twofold sort of dimension to this. On the one hand, if you're a Muslim reading a research done by a Muslim about Muslims, then you're going to be reading that as a Muslim. If you're a non-Muslim reading it, you're reading it as an interpretation of the social situation through an Islamic lens. So it does kind of serve both purposes, and it has a different meaning to the two different sets of people. Within that interpretive paradigm, I took a critical theory approach with an awareness of this post-colonial and indigenous knowledge perspective that is there, not just amongst indigenous communities, but also amongst minority communities, so African American type approach, which is to critical race theory and so on. So that's the type of approach I took, that it needs to have an impact, it needs to be something that is there to empower the people that are being researched. I then formulated a case study of Islamic Shakespeare Foundation schools and the use of holistic Islamic education as culturally relevant in these schools. It wasn't much point in anonymizing these schools for a number of reasons, not least because the work that we do there is so different to anywhere else that anybody who works around Muslim schools would know where we were straight away, because nobody else does halakha the way we do, nobody else does the kind of inventions fairs that we do, although some people are now beginning to take those things on. So bringing all of that together, then the actual research method that I used was halakha itself. Okay, so how did this halakha work, the research method that I used? I drew upon various qualitative approaches. So we have talked about critical theory. I've talked, another element of qualitative research is reflexive conversation. So the reflexive element. A participative research approach where you have participative action research, a collaborative research, something that is feeding back into what is happening. Narrative inquiry. This is a research method that many people are using. Autoethnography. There was an autoethnographic element to this because I was such an insider researcher and I was relating it back to my own experiences of education. So participant empowerment, and I've slotted into that spirituality. Halakha is a spiritual activity. You begin with recitation of the Quran, usually you end with a supplication. The referencing is always to Quran and Sunnah, and it's something that is seen as, not seeking knowledge is seen as a spiritual activity in Islam. So, for example, when we sit with the children, we remind them that there are hadith sayings of the Prophet, that when people sit in this kind of way and remember Allah, the angels actually descend and join upon them, and some of the hadith describe the angels sit above the circles and they make supplication for the people who are within that. So it's not something which is just a group of people having a discussion. It has a context which lots of Muslims relate to, and many Muslims would have attended halakha in all sorts of different formats throughout their lives. Okay, so what I did was, within the school, we formulated two groups. One was school leaders. These were founding members of the school, people like myself who had started homeschooling our kids, and that had grown into a range of groups, and then eventually we ended up registering 2 schools. So people who've been in this for about 8 to 9 years at this point, and who've been doing it for a long time and had a lot of very strong views about it. So I took part in that. I was part of that halakha, and there was certain topics that we discussed. Then we formed another group of teachers who'd been in the school for a little while, so sort of 18 months to 2 years, but were relatively new. Most of them had kids in the school as well, because a lot of our staff do, but some of them didn't, so they were more newer, so just to see what their perspective on a range of things was. And this halakha I didn't participate in, I just asked them to record it. It was actually very open. All I did was give them 6 topics to discuss, which are there. So I asked them to talk about their own experiences of education, what motivated them to come to this school for themselves and for their children, and their involvement in the school, what it meant to them. But then I gave them these topics, and they could discuss any of them, or some of them, or all of them, or how they wanted. As a research method, there was some issue with that, because I think I just left it too open. I didn't want to tell them, didn't want to structure them, but I left it far too open. And the first halakha that they had, the group that I wasn't there, was really interesting because they all talked about their own experiences, and I got some really rich data from there. The second one, but when they talked about their experiences, and these lasted about 2 hours each. Second one, they sort of decided to have a lovely chat, a staff room chat about their kids in their class and what had happened there and so on. So although they were kind of loosely talking about it, it was really not very focused at all. So in the third halakha, I actually gave them some questions that they could then select, and that refocused them back to it. So one thing I learned is that although it's good to be very open in the halakha, it's not necessarily good to be too open. So there's a lot of topics there, a lot of things that they can discuss, and their perspectives on things like community and community cohesion, what it is, what do they think education and identity is, the practice and the pedagogy in the school, and so on. I'm not going to discuss the findings because we don't have time to talk about that. That is in a paper which has been published, and I think it may be in the brochure. If not, I can certainly send you the link to it. Okay, so in terms of the halakha as research method, which was one of my research questions, what did we find? And that halakha was an exceptionally useful method in this specific study, and that's the only thing I'm claiming. I'm not claiming that it's the solution to all the research problems in the world, but in this particular study, it was very useful because it allowed participants to open up and share their experiences and drew out their own conceptualizations of themselves. It was effective in engaging them in a meaningful dialogue to explore different perspectives. They could discuss very openly with each other, but within a context that they were comfortable in. So it's an ideal medium for collective tafakkur. Tafakkur means thought or reflection, and it's a way of having a dialogue so that you come to a deeper understanding of a particular topic. And it's useful in any context where this is important to the research. It's also useful in providing Muslims with an opportunity to be open and express their personal views from their own worldview. Had I used a focus group or a group interview technique and not said to them, look, you can just sit and do halakha, then they probably would have been very cagey about giving references to, say, Quran or Hadith, or saying, well, this scholar said this, so therefore I think this. But because it was in the halakha format, and that's what they normally are used to, and that's what they do, then they were quite happy to do that. They were happy to discuss without those references, but they were also happy to give that reference, which is what is the framework by which they live their lives. It's the conceptualization of how they view the world. So in any qualitative study of Muslims' ways of seeing, this is invaluable. So reflexivity is important to all types of research. So my point would be that even in a large-scale quantitative study, or if you were doing a scientific experimental research, a Muslim researcher, and this would have a meaning, just like the Maori research has a meaning to Maori researchers, for Muslim researchers, you may benefit that as a research group you get together and you do a collective effort to try and seek out knowledge. Going back to the Muslim scientists we talked about, it's well known when the biographies that are written of their lives, that they would spend time in doing tafakkur, doing dhikr. They would spend time, if they were struggling with a problem, they would go back and pray and supplicate and ask, make dua, ask for guidance with their work. So this was something that was part of their heritage, part of their culture. This is practice that could be incorporated back into our research approaches as Muslims. And it can give meaning to the research activity by providing an opportunity to work through some of the Islamic research principles that I've suggested in designing and evaluating the research, as well as addressing difficulties that may arise during the course of the research. So there's a ways of using this that can be done quite creatively, not just amongst Muslim women who happen to like doing halakha and so are quite happy to participate in it. Okay, so that's a reference for the paper in which the findings, because some of you might be more interested in what they actually said than in the mode of researching them. And that's it. I will stop there, and hopefully there's lots of time for questions so that I don't have to rush anybody. Okay.
Wow, that's really interesting. The reference there is in the booklet, which is on the desk at the front, in case if you want to take that away and look that up, please do. Fascinating stuff. Who's going to kick off the questions?
Yes, thank you. I found that really interesting. You spoke mostly about halakha as a research method for a Muslim researcher, and I was wondering whether there are particular principles or anything about the approach that you think would be beneficial for non-Muslim researchers as well as their working in Muslim communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this diagram here, I know I went through things really fast, but I was just conscious of time. This particular diagram, it does highlight a lot of parallels with non-Muslim research approaches. So I did loads of reading on qualitative research methods, and Denzil and Lincoln's huge handbook, which I'm sure you've all seen, and all the different articles in there. And there is a lot of overlap. In fact, even in my ethics section, I found my personal views as a Muslim researcher on ethics had a lot of parallels with somebody called Christians, who talks about feminist communitarian ethical model, as opposed to, it's his words, a biomedical science ethical model. So he draws the contrast on research ethics from that, and I could really relate to what he was saying about that in terms of ethics. I could relate to the autoethnography aspect of reflection, as you're saying, that in autoethnography, when you're basically doing an ethnographic study of yourself, what you're really doing is taking that research as an opportunity to reflect and understand your own understanding better, and therefore improve and gain your understanding. And I think that that's what tafakkur, tadabbur, these Quranic concepts are essentially about. There's I can't recall now, somebody could correct me, this Quranic verse or a hadith of the Prophet, which is that to know Allah, know yourself. And so that whole self-reflection and intuition, which chimes well with practicing Muslims who have a spiritual dimension to their lives, it helps you to understand the world better, helps you to understand your place in it, understand what your community is about, understand actually some very difficult issues that we as adults, Muslims living in this society, face. One of the things that we find with halakha with the children is we give them that space to do that. And we give them a safe space to introduce ideas to them. Like, I'm introducing this idea. I don't want them to grow up. They've got, if they carry on going to Muslim schools and then they find themselves in university and they're in a class where religion is, they're doing science and they mention religion, it's going to be rather embarrassing for them, frankly. Okay, that's the reality we live in. So I don't want them to be in that situation. I want to introduce it to them that, some people think this, and to them that's wrong. I don't know if you heard that. Completely, to them that's an entirely alien concept. That why would you need to separate religion and science? Why, in their minds? Because the way they're learning about the world is they're learning it from that basis. Now, some people might think that that's indoctrination of them. It's possible. But then my point is that I'm giving them that alternative view. But I'm also giving them a safe space to say what they think about it, not just keep it to themselves. I mean, I've read pieces where researchers Muslim researchers. There's a lovely book called Wholeness and Holiness in Education by a lady called Zahra Al-Zira, and she talks about research paradigms, where she talks about her experience as a Muslim, and I could relate to it totally. Sitting in a university thinking, okay, this is all fine and well, but this doesn't speak to me. It's not, I have to leave myself over there to be part of this. And that's what we do that as adults. So children, as they grow up, I think it's our role to support them into learning how to manage that, how to deal with it.
Should we take a question in the back?
Just going on from what you just said there, about separating knowledge, if you like, from religion, and it also came up on one of the points that you mentioned about having that holistic kind of approach to research, whereby it wouldn't be just rational, but beyond rational, spiritual and intuitive. I mean, obviously the spirit of Islam is in line with that, but I mean, you can see why it's contested in the sense that spirituality and intuition is something which is subjective, and because it's subjective, it can't be either validated or refuted by the community at large, and therefore in that definition can't be described as knowledge as such, because it can't be shared with everyone. It can be someone's personal belief, and that's fine, but to share that with people on the basis of spirituality and intuition as opposed to rationale would be, so definitely the critical rationalists would come up with that view and say, well, this is incorrect because it can't be shared. It might be your knowledge, but it can't be defined as knowledge in a scientific way.
Yeah, there's lots of people who would hold that view, but there's equally people like the Maori people or Native Americans who would say, well, your knowledge doesn't make a jot of sense to me. You know, that might be knowledge that you've got in a university about my community, and it's all fine and well and documented and peer reviewed and referenced and all of that. Has nothing to do with my life. That is just there to exploit what I'm actually about. And so for me, for them, it's not just, I don't think this is just something that Muslims would hold. What is knowledge? Knowledge is something which I can understand and use and impact. And for me, the Quran is knowledge, and it has a spiritual dimension, and it is ilm. That's what it's all about. I can't. For me to say no, I don't want to address that. That's something that is not. It doesn't sit right with me, and it's not. It doesn't work. And I think that the value that you have here for social science in particular, this is complicated because the scientific method, some people have shown, actually came from principles that Muslim scientists put together. Right. So I'm not saying that the scientific method is alien to Islam. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that particularly in social research, particularly in things like education, all that scientific model I don't think is doing justice to education per se, or that's my field. I don't know about wider social research in that much depth, but I suspect a lot of the education research, when you talk to educational researchers, what is it feeding into? It's feeding into some standardized, target-driven, capitalist, business-minded model, which is destroying the really good work that educators are doing up and down this country. Educators who, in classrooms, are using intuitive knowledge to take a child further in their learning. Intuitive knowledge to make sure that that child has emotional support when they're needed. That's a type of knowledge which, why do we devalue that in our society? Why don't we value that knowledge as something which is having an impact? Why can it not be called knowledge when it's to do with human relationships and it's to do with how we understand each other? So that's the question I would put back to.
Yeah, sort of following on from that, do you find, I mean, obviously spirituality, is something that scares a lot of people, so but not even going there, do you find that with principles like collaboration, participation, action research, what is the response from institutions who are funding, who are, who actually make research possible? Or how do you find that works out?
I don't have a huge experience of that myself, so to draw on, but the fact that there is such a broad field out there of qualitative research methods, and people are doing all sorts of performance research now and various things in the arts and so on. and presumably they're getting funding for it. So I think that if you take the religious element out of it, I don't think it's that much of an issue. The religious element in it, I don't know. I don't know how that would work. I don't know. Like I said, qualitative research, which has these kind of elements, some of the things that I've drawn on in this diagram, there's a lot of it going on, so they must be getting funding to be doing it. But what I'm proposing is probably relatively new, so.
No, but I did want to ask a question, but I also wanted to just pick up on that last point, is that I think that methodological reflection may be going on as a byproduct of other things that are deemed to be perhaps more fundable or exciting, you know what I mean? And so this kind of work is happening around perhaps the edge of other work that's going on. But what I wanted to ask you about was the kind of the autoethnographic dimension of your work, and you know, if that's going to be a subheading in your methodology chapter, what's going to sit underneath it?
Well, what happened was that one of the things that came out in these halakha is it was fascinating how many of the women who were involved in this project of these primary schools had terrible primary education experiences themselves, and how many of them were actually immigrated into the country in their primary years, which is my experience. So I came to this country when I wasn't quite 6, and went straight into school, as you do. And I spent a good 3-4 years just totally lost. And you know, that was just what it was. That's how it was in those days. It was quite an English area. It wasn't somewhere where there's a lot of other Pakistanis. So many of them had similar kind of experiences. And then as you go through school, so in terms of the autoethnographic example, I was in Brent, and I went to the only girls' school in Brent. I used to take a bus 3 miles, and the girls' school was obviously packed with all the Muslims and the Hindus and the Sikhs in Brent, right? So there was there's a lot of us. And our lovely, well-meaning teachers were really, really concerned back in the day, as they are now, of this whole, arranged marriage thing. So we were subjected to these debates almost every few months, every term, there would be a debate on arranged marriage. Okay, and I remember the teachers sort of not getting it, and I'm not just talking about the Muslim girls here, but I remember the Hindu ones as well, and the Sikh ones saying, well, you know, we haven't actually got an issue with this. It's not like you're being forced into anything. So you're being introduced by your parents, so what's the big deal? And it's fine, our parents, they care about us, and they're not going to do anything that we don't really want. And and the teachers were just sitting there thinking, why can't we liberate you? You know, you need to be liberated, right? And I remember that kind of experience. And my colleagues, although I knew them quite well, but I didn't realise that they had all had similar kinds of experiences, and they didn't want that for their own kids. That's not what they wanted. They didn't want their kids going into school and being somebody else, and coming home and being somebody else, which is what we did. We did that for years. It was just automatic. I think for a lot of people in my generation, there was a turning point at university where you suddenly realised, no, actually, you had the confidence just to be yourself. You'd begin to practice. You started to cover. You were praying. You were quite happy to say that to people. Whereas before that, you'd never dare dream saying something like that to someone, because you'd just be too embarrassed. So that's something that I suppose the autoethnographic came out in that, is that it was very much a process of seeing that kind of, how much that actually had an impact on you. You don't realise till you think about it. You don't realise why you're doing what you're doing until you sit back in a halakha type situation and you're discussing with each other and you're thinking, okay, well that's a big motivating factor. We don't want the kids to have that uneasiness that comes with leading a double life, essentially.
Yes, question.
Thanks for that. I mean, I'm still trying to digest it all because it's such a kind of eye-opener, sort of deep. The question I have, I guess, is more practical. You mentioned you went into the school that you're involved in for several years, and so you mentioned as well the ethnographic aspect, how the biographies of yourself and all the other teachers kind of impacted the way in which the schools run. But how did you deal with the kind of the wake and the repercussions of going into this environment where you have close personal friendships and ties, but as a researcher rather than as a teacher or as a member of the organisation or a friend of it? So.
It wasn't really that much of an issue for me. I remember sitting there in the halakha I was taking part in, thinking to myself, You mustn't say stuff, let them speak, let them speak, you know, don't say anything. And I did manage to keep quiet, which I was quite proud of myself. But it wasn't really that much of an issue. It was just giving space and time and a recording and transcripts to things that we probably would have done quite naturally in lots of ways, particularly the halakha I was part of, because we were school leaders. These kind of things come up. I mean, there's a lengthy discussion in one of the halakha about child-centered play in early years and trying to see where the regulations meet Islamic concepts about educating very young children. And there was a point, the thing with I don't know how many of you know much about the education system in this country, but it's sort of subject to these fashion things that go on there. I mean, Michael Gove is, you know, I don't know what kind of fashion he's on at the moment, but it's whatever is in his head is going to become, you know, schools across the country are going to have to do it. So at that point, the whole issue of you do not interfere with the child's play was so heavily an aspect of early years that we certainly felt that children are not learning through this kind of play. Although in Islam, there's an actual hadith saying that you let children play till they're 7, so they should not have formal education till they're 7, right? So there's an Islamic ruling on this, but we felt that this is just getting silly because there's no space for the adult to intervene or to take their play forward and make it a meaningful learning experience. So we're having this quite lengthy discussion about it. I think what the halakha gave us time to do is, whereas probably we'd have rushed that in a meeting for 10, 15 minutes, we're saying, okay, we're sitting here now having a halakha about it. We've got time to talk about it, and it actually gave it more depth. Or what does this mean? Where's the child's autonomy in this? Where's the teacher autonomy, and how does that work, and how does it play out? And it was a very interesting discussion, and the transcripts of it are very telling of the different perspectives that came out.
Yes.
With the participants knowing that a particular halakha was part of your research, did you see any difference then between like what they would say in a halakha there as if it one that wasn't part of your research?
You know, up until that point, we didn't actually used to do staff halakha. Most of our teachers attend some sort of halakha outside, and for those of you in the Muslim community, you'll know that there's like every shape under the sun that of halakha. Some are literally you just sit and read Quran and it's a translation, or you're just reading and it's tajweed, and they call that halakha. And others are much more sort of, okay, we want to discuss a problem, let's bring up a social issue and how do we as Muslims deal with it. So there's a huge range. But we didn't actually have halakha for teachers in that format. We actually, one of the things that came out of it is we started doing that as opposed to sort of staff bonding time, if you like. We began to do that. I think that what I saw in the teachers' halakha, I mean, I wasn't there. Initially, they were all, there was the usual thing of they were very hesitant to begin with and so on. And then when they got into it, they were very relaxed. And I think they forgot that they were being recorded and so on. And like I said, they digressed quite a bit and so on, and then they'd come back to it. But yeah, so I don't think it was, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think it was such an issue there. But what I did get from it was what was a research you'd call very rich data. That definitely came out, is that you had so many things that I was, trying to work out which was the most important and I've done one paper on the findings. I've actually done a paper on this presentation today, which is under review at the moment. And there's a third paper that I want to draw from the masters, which is about their personal experience, their narratives of their lives, their biographical narratives that I've sort of half done. I'm working on that at the moment. So from one master's study to get 3 papers shows you that there's quite a lot of data there that the method facilitated in coming out.
Can I ask something? I just want to ask a question about critical reflection on your research, really. Because I mean, it's all really fascinating, and I just absolutely see the potential of halakha as an Islamic research method. I slightly raised my eyebrows when you put up your findings slide, and you said your first finding was that you found out halakha was a really good research method. And I thought, well, there's a slightly circular logic to that, given that you started off from a faith position, that halakas were used by Prophet Muhammad, therefore, there's an Islamic justification for halakha. So perhaps you could talk about that a bit. I mean, would it have been possible to reach any other conclusion other than that halakha was a really good research method?
I think if it hadn't worked, in the sense that when I put the findings up for this, that was for the third question in my research questions. So the first two were more about the topic of Islamic education, identity, and so on. And the findings for that are not mentioned in this presentation. So there were, I think that's what you have to sort of see, is that those findings, that's something that came out of the data that the halakha generated. And what I'm saying to answer the third question is that in that context, to get that kind of information and to be able to do that level of analysis of it, it was a really good method for getting that kind of information. So that if I'd done a focus group and given, you know, and it had been an environment which was alien to the participants, then they may not have opened up in that kind of way. They may not have been as comfortable talking about things from their worldview. They may well have tried to explain themselves with using a different type of language, which would have given different type of data. Okay, so in that sense, the third research question now, which is this halakha useful? I mean, from this study, I thought it was. Like I said, how far that would translate elsewhere, I don't know. So if you took a different group, or like, for example, something like you were doing about parenting, if you took a group of Muslim parents who perhaps don't necessarily, not all of them may have attend halakha or so on, and you try to do that with them or do a group interview, it may not work as well. I don't know. But I think in this instance, in a community where they're familiar with it, it did work very well.
Probably not much time left, given that the taxi's on its way, but you want to squeeze in the last one? Go on then.
So I'll look a second then. This is a short question. I was just wondering, when you describe this halakha, I would more instinctively kind of, from my kind of reading and what I've read, think of a shura. Was there any reason you chose halakha as the term and not shura?
Shura is you taking advice on a particular topic, isn't it? You're asking a question which needs to be answered. This was more an open-ended type of discussion about trying to understand our own practice. So in a way, it's practitioner research. Okay, so it's practitioners reflecting upon what it is that they do and why that's effective or why it's not effective. And that's essentially what the teachers did, which is different to shura. So shura would be if I go into the staff room or we have a meeting and I say, okay, well, there's this new regulation, how do we tackle that? Then they would give me their perspectives on it, and then that's one way of moving forward. I think this is a slightly different thing to that.
Okay, well, I think we'd better wind it up. It's been a really interesting hour. So let's thank and just to remind people before you disappear that we've got another talk next Tuesday. Dr. Leo Musavi, who's talking about Muslim converts.